Welcome back. Hour number 2 of Spooky South Coast. Tim Weisberg here, along with the silent assassin Matt Costa, talking about the paranormal as we do each and every Saturday night. And co-hosting with us tonight, we have Chris Balzano. Chris, thank you for co-hosting with us tonight.
No, thank you. I mean, we were talking about the legend tripping earlier. I had contacted Gary to ask him a few questions about an Allman Brothers legend that we wanted to trip this summer when we were on our road trip, and I wasn't sure how I'd be received. And it was like putting on an old glove, talking to him like back and forth via text. I mean, he's just such a wealth of information that I'm glad I can just be involved.
Well, it's funny because I asked you if you could co-host, and you're like, "Oh, I wasn't sure if you'd want me to," and I was like, "It's Gary. Of course we want you to."
I've just been listening to episodes, and you and Stephanie have got a good thing going, so I didn't want to put our male vibe all over it. So,
well, you put up some links earlier for people to check out related to tonight's show.
Yeah, because we had posted something earlier, and I just kind of reposted it for people. It actually links over to mine, to my blog, but it's all the Gary Patterson episodes.
You're using us for clicks, is what you're saying.
Shamelessly, using you for clicks. It's all the R. Gary Patterson episodes, including the Tim Weisberg interview on the Beatles anniversary, as well as a few other episodes we've done about weird rock and roll connections. So just check the Facebook feed on the Spooky South Coast, and you'll see the link to that.
Well, as I mentioned, joining us tonight as our guest is the one, the only R. Gary Patterson. And if you want to check out some of his work, I highly recommend picking up his books. You can get The Walrus Was Paul, The Great Beatle Death Clues. And you can also Take a Walk on the Dark Side, Rock and Roll Myths, Legends, and Curses. And Gary, I know that you've been working on a number of different projects. What have you been working on lately?
Well, it's interesting. I have a friend, his name is Richard Serrett, you may know, who does weekends on Coast to Coast. I've been known to do Coast to Coast several times. And right now we're thinking about putting together our own syndicated radio show.
Excellent.
That we can do this a lot more. And I'm looking for a station in Knoxville that I can use as a home station, because I hate to drive to Nashville to do it. But we could do that. I'm doing that. I'm working on a couple of television things. I've got one that we're working on that's going to have to do a lot more with rock and roll, maybe some of the strange and unexplained with it. And I'm working on another book, so I always stay busy, and I'm always looking for great stories. And I guess it's just the way I look at it, because when I write, I'm not really interested in writing a book of chapters of biographies and, like obituaries. I'm not into that at all. Give me the Twilight Zone. Give me something that when I read it, I'm sort of, oh my gosh, how strange is that? That's what I'm into. And I have to tell you that in my new book that I'm working on, I've got some stories that are just really, really, incredibly spooky. So when I get it done, we'll have to do this again.
Oh, absolutely.
Does the new generation have that, Gary? I mean, is there a mythology? I think we've talked about this with some other guests. Like, is there the same kind of mystique, that same kind of mystery behind them, that you're getting news stories, or you're just getting a kind of stories about the old brigade that have yet to come out?
Well, I'll tell you, it takes a while to be a legend. And, there's a lot of stories that have strange inferences. But, when you take something that, whether it's bad luck or a curse or whatever like that, whatever you want to call it, sometimes it keeps on giving. Like you take Buddy Holly. Now, we talked about this a little earlier tonight, but I read an interview in Rolling Stone magazine that something like 50% of college freshmen had never heard of the Beatles. All right? To me, that's kind of spooky. But if you put Buddy Holly's name out there, then you would have to be, I'd be surprised if 30% of college freshmen had heard of Buddy Holly. And by the way, I'm a consultant on a Buddy Holly documentary that's being filmed right now, too. So, I didn't grow up with Buddy Holly. I would go to a record store when those things existed, and I saw this guy who was kind of skinny with these real heavy black frames, and I thought, this guy can't be cool. Give me something else. And I had no idea he wrote the songs that he had written, so I sort of was a late blossom to Buddy Holly. But I still understand greatness, and I understand the influences, especially with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones and the British Invasion. But, yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to take a new group that comes out. It's kind of like who's going to be bigger than the Beatles or who has a story that lasts. I mean, there's some new artists that have crossed the line that I'm writing about. And sometimes, I mean, I can go all the way back to Bessie Smith, who very few people have heard of. But to me, when you talk about Highway 61 or Robert Johnson, the Crossroads, 3961, then, you know, Bessie Smith died on that road. There's a lot of strange things that happened in Clarksdale, Mississippi to a lot of R&B artists.
Mm-hmm.
And why did Bob Dylan call his album Highway 61 Revisited? You know, so there's a lot of good questions you can go in. To me, I usually start a foundation. I start like a history book. You usually start at the beginning and you work your way up. So right now, I'm working my way up. And we do have some new artists that's going to make the cut in the new one. But, you know, it still has some fascinating stories. And I don't think I'm going to do an Amy Winehouse thing on it because we're going to let the 27 Club rest for a while. But I always find there's strange things. Like Jimi Hendrix has been something that sort of appealed to me recently. And I had an interview that I put on tape with James Tabby Wright, who was probably one of the assistant managers under Mike Jeffery. And on this interview, he talks about how Jimi Hendrix was murdered.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Because the common story is that he choked to death on his own vomit, right?
And that's what you hear. But here's what you probably haven't heard. No one interviewed the ambulance drivers. No one interviewed the doctor at the hospital where he came in. A lot of the things we were told that happened that day didn't happen. And it was up to Kathy Etchingham, who Jimi Hendrix's first girlfriend in London, who he wrote The Wind Cries Mary for. She was the one who went out and brought up all this new information. Now, to me, which always seemed odd, was that when you read the coroner's report, they talk about Hendrix had like a bottle of wine in his hair. And when they did the toxicology report, the alcohol level in his bloodstream was like 2 beers. But wine was oozing out of his mouth, which means his lungs were filled with wine. So, did he asphyxiate? And those 9 sleeping pills that he took. Well, according to Tabby Wright, Hendrix was murdered because he was leaving Mike Jeffery. Mike Jeffery had borrowed, I think, $2 million or $1 million from the mob to build Electric Ladyland Studios. And if Hendrix had left him, he would owe a great deal of money and probably not be around much longer. Jimi Hendrix had a $2 million life insurance policy.
Wow.
Now, when the ambulance got to the flat, the only person there was Jimi Hendrix, who they said was already dead. Monica Daneman, the one who tells the story about fixing Jimi Hendrix a tuna fish sandwich, which Hendrix hated tuna fish and would never eat it, but she said that she'd fixed him the sandwich and that he was fine when she got up to buy a pack of cigarettes. Well, that can't be true. The door was unlocked. It was open. The ambulance comes in. They take him. He's already DOA. They take him to the hospital. And I was told, and like I said, it's on tape, that the sleeping pills stopped the gagging reflex. and that 3 men came up carrying bottles of wine, and essentially Hendrix was waterboarded. They held him down and poured bottles of wine down his throat directly into his lungs. Now, if you look at the toxicology report, he had such a small amount of alcohol in his bloodstream, not enough to be oozing from his mouth, implies that he was dead before the alcohol could enter his bloodstream. So you have that story. Also, he told me that at Electric Ladyland Studios, Mike Jeffery was there, and that Monica Daneman and he were talking, and he heard Mike Jeffery say, "Well done, darling. Here's your money."
Oof.
Now, whatever that means, I know that the night Hendrix died, he had visited his longtime girlfriend, Devin Wilson, who he wrote Dolly Dagger for. He spent some time at her apartment. Monica Daneman drove her car to pick him up, blowing the horn, embarrassing him, so he went out and got in the car. Was it a lover's feud? You know? And I know that shortly after Hendrix's funeral in Seattle, Devin Wilson takes a swan dive off the Hotel Chelsea. And then a few years later, Monica Daneman takes a hose, puts it on her muffler in a Mercedes, takes it in through the side window, and asphyxiates herself on carbon monoxide poisoning. So you have a lot of people who had tragic deaths. Mike Jeffery. All right, Mike Jeffery was a member of MI6. That's a James Bond group, right?
Right.
And he was a master of explosives. And he used to terrify people. Matter of fact, when Hendrix was going into Toronto, they found heroin in his suitcase. And Hendrix was convinced that Jeffery had put the heroin there just to show Hendrix that he could get him anytime he wanted. A few weeks before Hendrix died, he'd been kidnapped, tied up, and put in a garage, and Jeffery saved him. Or did Jeffery have him kidnapped and then show him, that he could save him, how much trouble he was under? But, when you take a look at all that, Mike Jeffery was brought back from Spain to do an inquest in England, and on the way back in his plane, the plane blew up, killing everybody on board, and the only thing they found of Mike Jeffery was a wristwatch. And, you take a look at all this, it's rather bizarre, isn't it?
And it doesn't just stop with, if you want to talk about members of the 27 Club being part of this too, but it doesn't just stop with Hendrix either. There's been a lot of information that's come out over the last couple of years of people looking into the theory that Kurt Cobain didn't commit suicide, that he was actually murdered.
I've always had theories on that as well, because I have a friend whose name is Ian Halpern who wrote Who Killed Kurt Cobain, if you've read it. And we did a couple of radio shows together, and he was always convinced that Cobain was murdered. And, the thing that gets me is if a guy was going to commit suicide and he took enough heroin to kill himself in minutes, why would he take the heroin and then take a shotgun and put it in his mouth and shoot himself? And the other thing is about the shotgun, normally when people commit suicide with a shotgun, they usually use their toe to pull the trigger. He had his shoes on. His arms are short. And the strangest thing was there were no fingerprints on the shotgun. You can't kill yourself and wipe the fingerprints off. And one thing that they haven't brought up was that his credit card was taken and was being used until they announced finding his body, and then the credit card was not used anymore. Now, what makes it even more interesting is I did a TV series with Vh1 called Vh1 Confidential. You could probably go to YouTube and find it. And there were things that could not be brought up on that television show.
Wait, things related to this case that you couldn't talk about?
Things that they would not let us talk about.
That VH1 was keeping you from saying?
Well, when you go to Hollywood and you work with VH1, you go in this one building. One floor is VH1. Another floor is MTV. and I think CMT or one of the country channels they do is on another. Well, each of those networks has their own band. Like, for instance, VH1 has a group of bands that they promote. MTV had some when they used to do rock and roll that they would promote. And it had to do with the catalog and who owned the rights. So I'll leave that to your imagination. But
Well,
still,
for
you can figure
the record,
it out.
you cannot find controversy on YouTube.
VH1 Confidential.
Yes, you cannot find it on YouTube.
You're kidding me.
Because I've been looking for it for years. I think I even contacted you and asked you, like, do you just have it on tape somewhere? Because some of the stuff that you cover there, as you were talking, I was thinking about the episode that you guys did on Bob Marley and the controversy about him potentially having been assassinated, and it's not out there.
Now that's odd because I saw an episode on YouTube a week ago because I was sending it in and I thought, let me check this. Now, you know,
well, maybe it's recent. Recently, they've put it up there, but I've been searching for years for it. So.
Yeah. And a lot of shows I used to do with Coast to Coast used to be on YouTube, like the one I did with the Doors. And I got Robbie Krieger and Ray Manzarek to come on, and we did a whole night on the Doors. And that was a really great show, and it used to be on YouTube, and they were made to take it down. So you know how the copyright laws are. But every now and then, if you keep looking, you can find it.
We leave all of ours up for free for everybody to download whenever they want to. So, you know, just so everybody knows, Spooky South Coast, all the previous R. Gary Patterson episodes are right there for you. But
that's what we like.
VH1 Confidential is now up.
All right.
For the record. But so you can go in there and get it.
Watch them quickly because, you know, Viacom might pull them down again. And that's the thing.
Viacom owns the world.
I've seen some of the TV shows that I've worked on. I've gone to try to like pull, or like, you know, if they do something like on Lizzie Borden and we go to film there, I've tried to pull clips off of it, and it's always like now they're pulling it all down and putting it on their apps, and so people are just kind of uploading like them recording it off their TV and putting it up on YouTube. So people are finding ways around those copyright laws. But one of the interesting things about that Kurt Cobain case, though, is that one of the theories. And I don't know how much you've explored this, Gary, but one of the theories is that it was actually Courtney Love that was behind it, because it makes sense on the surface when you think about it, because her career is launched by the fact that her husband is dead. And in the first song, the first video that comes out from the Live Through This album, which, you know, most of that album was written by Kurt, but the first song that comes out is Doll Parts, and she becomes, you know, the sentimental favorite that propels this album into huge status. And then the second album comes out and it's nowhere near as good because it didn't have Kurt's hand in it.
Well, think of this. If the rumor was that Kurt and Courtney were getting a divorce, and in the divorce settlement, if a widow received a payment, say, of $100,000, $200,000, maybe $1 million, what would it be better to have? A lump sum or royalties eternal?
Right.
Every time a Nirvana song is played on the radio, a check comes in. Now, here's your conspiracy theory. One television network played a heck of a lot of Nirvana videos.
That is true.
And, you know, sometimes you have to play nice, and some things you have to leave out.
And if we really started to dig into Kurt versus the establishment and some of the things that he was threatening to do at the time, then, you know, you can kind of understand why he had a target on his back, because here's a guy who he basically wanted to pull himself away from the spotlight. And I'm not sure the exact timing, but I think by this point, Pearl Jam had already done the same thing. Pearl Jam had already said, we're done with music videos. We're not making any more of these things. And so you're going to have two of the biggest, and Kurt is not on board with being able to put out more videos for the In Utero album. So now you've got two of your biggest draws in music saying, we don't want to play ball with MTV anymore.
And you're right. You know, that's the thing. And, you know, just there's a lot of money in royalties, especially artists and, you know, very popular recording artists. And then what happens when an artist dies? What's really strange, and I guess it goes all the way back to the great first rock and roll fatality. A lot of people think it was Buddy Holly in the plane crash, but it goes back further to a guy whose name was James Alexander, whose name was Johnny Ace. Now, the reason he changed his name to Johnny Ace was that his father was a minister. They lived in Memphis, and they had a piano at their home. And while they were home, when Johnny Alexander played the piano, he played a lot of religious music. And when his father left, he went straight into R&B. So when he got a record deal, he changed his name to Johnny Ace as not to bother his father or disrespect him. But one night, he'd been drinking, and it was, I think, Christmas night in Houston, Texas, with Big Mama Thornton, and he had a gun. And he carried his pistol with him everywhere he went. And he had this penchant for shooting at road signs as he drove down the road. But he had his girlfriend with him, and he had one of her friends. And as he was walking behind the stage, he took the gun, he pulled the hammer back and put it next to his girlfriend's head and pulled the trigger. Went click. Then he takes the gun and he points it at his girlfriend's friend's head, pulls the trigger, again, click. Big Mama Thornton reaches over, grabs the gun, says, "Give me this." She gets it away from him, and then he grabs it back and says, "Look, it's not loaded." And he puts it to his head, pulls the trigger, and books his ticket to rock and roll heaven.
Mm.
And a lot of people said, well, you know, he committed suicide. Well, or he was playing Russian roulette. It was accidental. But what wasn't accidental was how much money Johnny Ace's record company made when they came out with the late, great Johnny Ace for a guy who had 2 songs, and one of them was called Pledging My Love. So dead rock stars can be worth a lot of money.
I'm pretty sure that Tupac has recorded more albums since he died.
Some of them have this penchant of creating better songs after they die. You know, really. I know there was a psychic in Germany who said that Elvis Presley had contacted him and had written all these new songs in the afterlife, and he wanted the German psychic to have a record deal so he could sing Elvis's new songs. Well, what was interesting is Elvis must have learned to write songs in the afterlife because he'd never written one song in his life.
Right, exactly. Well,
So,
I mean, you know, I guess you gain some perspective when you when you go to the other side. You know, maybe it makes you a little bit of a better writer.
It does. Gives you a whole different perspective, doesn't it?
So, is there when we're talking about some of these older cases, you know, these things that kind of predate when we start assigning curses to this, when we start because I think the stories really started to get sexy when you got to the Beatles' Death Clues, and when you started to get to that era of when there was a bit of the occult attached to a lot of this stuff. And we had a guest on a while back here on Spooky South Coast. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work. His name's George Case, and he wrote a book called Here's to My Sweet Satan, and he looked at the occult influence in pop culture. And I think it was when people started to pay attention to some of that darker side of things that they allowed the darker side to seep into pop culture. And I think people will look at rock stars who die young or who die mysteriously and say, you're stepping into that world. You're allowing that into your life. You're allowing that into your creative vision, and that's going to end up costing you in the end. And do you think that that's kind of one of the tie-ins that we're seeing with some of these deaths?
It's sort of like a Faustian, you know, like
right.
The Tragical History of Dr. Faustus, or, you know, Goethe's Faust. The idea that what forces you play with have consequences. And if you go back to 1967, when the Beatles came out with Sgt. Pepper's, if you look on the top row, on the left-hand side, you see Aleister Crowley.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, they considered him this magician, this figure. And a lot of people even knew him, thought he was a charlatan, but the whole idea was in '67, people that period were looking for answers. And, you had more of an anti-religious vibe that was going on and more interest in Far Eastern religions. You can look at the Beatles on that. And if you went down Carnaby Street, you could see Graham Bond wearing a wizard's outfit who claimed to be the illegitimate son of Aleister Crowley. And people were obsessed with the stories. That's why the Rolling Stones got so deep into the occult. And, the Beatles were just interested in the Crowley thing. I think I read that McCartney was the one who suggested they put Crowley on the cover. But you did have interest. And, of course, when Jimmy Page came along and started his Equinox, which was an occult bookstore, and started collecting a lot of Crowley memorabilia, and then you had the Zeppelin curse, and you had the house at Boleskine, where Jimmy Page bought it, which, by the way, is one of the episodes on Vh1 Confidential, if you get a chance to see it. And it shows a lot about that. So when you take a look at that, one of the funny things is I was out in Los Angeles recording the segment on Jimmy Page, and you have this occult filmmaker. His name is Kenneth Anger. And Kenneth Anger is the one who put the curse on Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin, because Page didn't complete the musical score for his film called Lucifer Rising. So VH1 wanted me to talk about Kenneth Anger. I might be a little superstitious at times, and I said, I don't know if I want to talk about Kenneth Anger. Oh, come on, it's in your book. Talk about him. I said, okay. And then all at once, this is about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I said, Kenneth Anger. And as soon as I said the name, this dog started howling outside. It's kind of unnerving. And I looked at the director. She looked at me. I looked at the guy doing the camera and the sound. We just looked at each other for a second. There was a pause. She said, okay, let's change the topic, because it did seem strange. Now, I know you guys are really into paranormal investigations, and I'm just going to have to come up to Massachusetts and hang out sometime. You'll have to take me and show me some stuff. But let me tell you a good story. And when I went to the Crossroads that Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil, I went to a party with several of my fraternity brothers and their wives, girlfriends. We drove down to Clarksdale, found the Crossroads. We had our picture made standing in the cemetery that Robert Johnson had claimed the devil taught him to play the guitar at night. Now, we went during the day, early, but we had a number of pictures made of the group with the Crossroads over our shoulder. They were made in digital cameras, made with regular cameras. Not one photo came out.
Wow.
Oh, it gets better. As we were walking around the cemetery that was, I think it was built in 1850, there was this huge black snake that was coiled around a tombstone. And one of the guy's wives took this stick and started beating that snake with it. Oh. And, I looked at her and I said, well, I don't want to get too freaked out here, but, this is a snake in a cemetery that Robert Johnson said the devil appeared and taught him to play the guitar, and right. Devil, snake, you might want to leave that snake alone. And I was kind of kidding. So she does. And as we get ready to leave, Alan, the guy whose house we stayed at, one of my fraternity brothers, he said, Gary, you know what we got to do? And I said, no, what do we got to do? He said, we got to bring some dirt back. So here he and I get down the middle of this crossroads, and we dig up dirt from the center, and we put it in these plastic sandwich bags, put it in the back of the car, go back to his house, which was in Jackson, Tennessee. Now, that was a Saturday. Sunday morning, we get up to go home. We all say goodbye, and I head back to Nashville. And the girl I was with is with me, and we switched cars. I left my car in Cookeville, and we were going to pick it up because she lived in Chattanooga. And on our way to Nashville, I called my attorney and two other friends, Jamie Oldacre, who was there at Clapton's drummer, and Leo Lyons, who played bass in 10 Years After, to have dinner with me. And we go into Nashville, and we're sitting there, and I say, you know what I got in my car? I said, I've got dirt from the Crossroads. You want me to go get it? And Jamie Oldacre looks at me and says, don't bring that in here. He said, that's too much mojo. Because Eric Clapton would not touch Muddy Waters' guitar because he said, it's too much mojo. Mm. So I knew this was kind of interesting. Now, Leo Lyons, he said, yeah, bring it in. Let me see it. So we had some fun. I get my car. I go home. I didn't have my cell phone on. But when I get home, my phone is literally blowing up, and I find that the girl who had the stick that was beating the snake, when she got home, she was rushed to the hospital with a brain aneurysm.
Oh, whoa.
The guy who dug the dirt with me, Alan, 15 minutes after we left his home, had a heart attack, was in intensive care. And the girl who went with me, strange things were happening in her house. Her alarm system was going off, motion detectors, but there wasn't anything there. The police kept coming. She was terrified that something had followed her back. Now, what makes it worse is that when I went to get the dirt out of my car, I realized I'd left it with her. So the next morning, she calls me from work, and she says, the police have been here all day. I know it's that dirt. And I said, well, here's what you do. You take that dirt, and you throw it in the river. So she does. And it's a heavy rain that night, but she throws it in the river, and everything seemed to be calm. Well, they had a birthday party for me about, 3 weeks later, and a lot of them came up to my party, especially Alan. He had recovered, so his heart attack, was something he was able to beat, and I noticed they brought me a gift. And I saw this strangely wrapped gift, and when I opened it, there was this oblong bottle. It looked like something from the 1930s, like you'd find in a drugstore. Mm-hmm. Had a cork stopper. And when I looked at it, at the very bottom was about 4 tablespoons of dirt.
Oh, no.
With a little plaque that said, the Crossroads. Now, I have that on my desk. And every now and then when I'm writing, I kind of glance over at it. Now, I don't see any blue glow. But I think what happened, the next year I was in Rome, and I was at the Vatican, and I decided, why not bring back a souvenir? So I bought a crucifix. I'm not Catholic, but I thought it looked cool, so I bought it. And when I was going through, the nun at the cash register in the bookstore, she said, would you like the Holy Father to bless this for you? I said, who? She said, the Holy Father, the Pope. The Pope will bless my crucifix that I spent $5 on. Oh, yes, no charge. So I said, sure. So I left my crucifix. The guy, one of my friends who was with me, said, you think his Holy Father would bless these golf balls for me? He said, of course. Now, I never asked him if they hit the water and walked across the water and went automatically in hole-in-ones, but after we got back from dinner that night, I looked on my doorknob of the hotel room, and there was my crucifix. So when I got home, the dirt is on the left side, and the crucifix is on the right. So I guess they balanced themselves out. Now, my former girlfriend, who had the terror of the dirt, I talked to her not too long ago, and she said that she cannot escape Robert Johnson, that she'd gone into the bathroom of this barbecue place in Chattanooga. When she shut the door, there was a life-size picture of Robert Johnson staring at her. So I guess sometimes the shock stays with you. But that is a true story, and whether it was all coincidence, I don't know. But nothing happened to me. And maybe it's because I have the proper respect for urban legends.
Well, I mean, it could also be the fact that, you're the chronicler of this. So you need to have, in order for these stories to be told, there needs to be somebody that is still around to tell them. And that's pretty much the way that a lot of these legends come about, is because there has to be somebody there that experienced it, that can go on and tell the story. That's why, whenever you see these movies, the bad guy always spares one person to go and tell the story to everybody else.
Yeah, and
Well,
you
I'm
also
glad
be
I'm
that
a
person
storyteller.
who's seen the connections and can kind of formulate it and actually like give it some kind of context, as opposed to just being a storyteller, which Gary does very well.
Well, I think I've never looked at it that way, but I think there could be something to it. I know that when I was watching Supernatural, they start having these crossroad demons now. And I kept saying, I wonder if these guys read my book. Because I really go into it, about the African god Legba at the crossroads and all that. But all of it's, there's just some really interesting stories. And the way my mind picks up on things, we were talking about Hendrix earlier. Look at Stevie Ray Vaughn. I remember seeing him, and he would do this section where he would talk, and he had this line where he says, I don't know why I'm here, and they took Jimi Hendrix. And, because he did a really couple of great covers of Hendrix songs, but I'd heard that his last performance, he started really getting freaked out about this Hendrix comparison, and one of the fans had actually painted a picture of Jimi Hendrix and tried to give it to him, and he wouldn't take it. And the last performance he did, he was on fire. He was playing. Clapton was with him. And he just let Stevie Ray keep playing and playing. The last song he played, Sweet Home Chicago. Do you know who wrote that song?
Robert Johnson.
Robert Johnson. And then, in Rock and Roll Deja Vu, his brother Jimi, Jimmy's wife Connie, are going to take a helicopter back to Chicago. And as they make their way to the helicopter, they find out there's only one seat left. So Stevie Ray asked his brother, he said, do you mind if I have this seat? I'm just so tired. Will you guys drive back? And they agreed to let him go. That kind of reminds me of an infamous coin toss with the Beechcraft Bonanza, And of
Now,
course, the helicopter
do you know anything? I'm sorry, Gary. Do you know anything about the story, about?
Losing a little bit.
Month there was another connection with Hendrix. What, you're losing me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah,
But, maybe 2 months earlier, he had lost a whole bunch of his guitars when an awning had fallen on it or something had fallen on it. But there was another Hendrix connection with that. Do you know anything about that?
About Hendrix losing some of his guitars?
No, Stevie Ray Vaughan, about 2 months before he died. There was another. I'm trying to remember it. I can't remember why I had read it before, but there was another Hendrix connection, and he had done something very similar to that, or there was something with Jimi Hendrix, and then both of his, something had fallen and crushed almost all of his guitars, those signature, SRV guitars that he had. Do you remember that story at all? Do you know anything about that?
I remember, the guitars disappeared right before, couldn't find them. You know what the other strange similarity is with Hendrix and Stevie Ray Vaughan is Eric Clapton. Because
right,
the night
and then
Hendrix
a whole bunch
died, he was supposed to meet Clapton for a jam session with Sly and the Family Stone. And the night of the death, Clapton had bought a gift for Jimi Hendrix. It was a left-handed Stratocaster. And they see each other at this performance, but Hendrix didn't show, and when Clapton found out the next day that Hendrix has died, I saw this video, this film, that was made with Clapton telling the story. And at the end, he says, I don't know why Jimi left me. And he said, because he left me here. He said, he left me here with this left-handed guitar. And then tears start running from his eyes. Well, Eric Clapton was the last to play with Stevie Ray Vaughn that night.
Well,
So
I was going to
Clapton
ask you, there
was
seems
at
to be so
both-
much about Clapton. Like, why is, I mean, Clapton, covered Crossroads. Clapton's involved in so much of
He
this
did.
stuff. I mean, why is, and as a matter of fact, I used to teach an R. Gary Patterson lesson in class from some of your teachings and some of the things from your books, and we would talk about all these connections, and even the kids would say, well, yeah, but what about Clapton? Like, you keep mentioning all this, and then Clapton was there, and then Clapton. Well, why does nothing bad happen to him? And I'm like, well, his kid died, except for, and Tim and I were talking about this earlier, like, well, except for he got his probably biggest hit based on a song he wrote about that incident. So what is up with the Clapton connection, and why does he seem to be spared from all this?
That's interesting.
In your opinion.
I mean, look at Derek and the Dominoes. Wasn't that a really bad luck band?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You had
Because you had
Dwayne Allman.
Dwayne Allman was in it. Yep.
Yeah, and then you had Carl Radle, and you had Jim Gordon. I think the only one that was untouched was Bobby Whitlock. But, Jim Gordon, my gosh, paranoid schizophrenic. I guess I'll tell you some stuff that very few people know, because that's how we like it, right, guys?
Oh, absolutely.
Do you know why Jim Gordon do you know why Eric Clapton left the Dominoes? Because there was an argument between Jim Gordon at the very beginning of Bell Bottom Blues. And Jim Gordon started sinking deeper into paranoid schizophrenia. And in his mind, his mother was denying him food. She denied him the ability to play the drums. So to stop the voices in his head, he knocks on his mother's door. And when she answers it, he beats her to death with a hammer.
Ooh.
And then he goes after his sister. His sister, she was able to escape. And today, Jim Gordon is in a prison for the mentally insane in California. He's on his medication, which helps. And I guess a trivia question, who was the only person ever convicted of murder to ever win a Grammy? And the answer is Jim Gordon, because he composed the piano part at the end of Layla.
Mm.
And when we were doing the Vh1 thing, the Vh1 was saying, well, Jim Gordon's dead. I said, I don't think he's dead. I said, what you need to do is you need to make sure you have your facts straight. And then they found out, he's not dead. He's still in prison. But, I mean, those are tragic stories, and Carl Radle's death is mysterious, the bass player. And, of course, Dwayne Allman. And here's a good thing about the Allmans, because I know Chris was talking to me about it. And I know we always tell the story about the drug overdose in Nashville, where he'd taken too much opium, and his fingertips had turned blue, and they rushed him to the hospital. And the doctor told him that there was really no hope, that he was too far gone. And Barry Oakley runs out to the parking lot, falls on his knees, and he says, God, just give him one more year to live, just one more year, and pleaded. About 20 minutes later, the doctor comes out and says, guys, I've never seen anything like it. He's going to make it. And he did. But 1 year to the day, he was killed in a motorcycle accident. Exactly 1 year to the day. And Barry Oakley died 1 year and 13 days later, a few hundred feet from the intersection. Now, here's the thing that was a puzzling thing for me. Dwayne Allman wasn't buried until Barry Oakley died. His body was kept in storage for a year and 13 days, like he was waiting on it. And they were both buried together at Rose Hill Cemetery, which goes to our graveyard.
Is there a reason why he was not buried?
That I had asked, and nobody wanted to talk about it. Now I know the answer. Are you ready?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's what I like about you guys. You're always ready. Well, it appears that when he was killed at the accident, I think it was Barry Oakley's wife and the girl that Dwayne was dating, whose name was Dixie, were driving behind him. And when Dwayne hit the truck, his motorcycle flew up in the air, hit him, crushed most of his organs. And the girl he was with goes running up to the truck driver saying, "You've killed my husband." She wasn't his wife, but she was a common-law wife. So they have his funeral, and the Allman Brothers set up. They play, they play the songs for him. I know that Dickie Betts played his Les Paul for him. And what happened was that Dwayne had a daughter and a previous marriage. And his wife's name was Donna. So there was a huge court case. It turns out that the girl who was behind him when he was killed, Dixie, had claimed to be his wife, but she was already married to some other guy. So what happened, they had to wait till a claim was made, because it was a lawsuit. And Donna and their daughter comes to Macon, Georgia, and when she gets there, after the suit's determined, because his daughter, of course, was his heir, the money goes to her to support her, and then his ex-wife, Donna, is the one who chooses the grave. But nobody was in a hurry to bury him, which to me was just really strange. That's a strange story. And I know that if you go to Rose Hill Cemetery today, I've heard stories that his sister, Barry Oakley's sister, and her husband closely guard that grave, because a lot of people really don't have proper respect. Like, they'll go out and try to do etchings of the tombstones, like with blue crayons, and it really destroys the marble. Or people want to take souvenirs, like they'll chip off some of the marble. They took these two small angels and all that. So it seems like even when you're famous, people want souvenirs. They want a piece of it. When probably the most bizarre story of a graveyard in rock and roll was about 20 years after the plane crash in which Ronnie Van Zant was killed. Someone broke into his grave in Jacksonville, Florida, along with Steve Gaines. And Steve had been cremated along with his sister, Cassie, and they had punctured the bag, and some of the ashes remains had fallen out. They had pulled Ronnie Van Zant's coffin from his crypt, but they weren't able to open it. So Judy Van Zant decided that to make sure this wouldn't happen, that she would put the coffin under so many feet of concrete to make sure it wouldn't happen again. So here's your trivia question. According to the legend, what were they after? The grave robbers. And the answer was that when Ronnie Van Zant died, he was buried wearing his Texas hat or hat, a fishing pole, and barefoot. But there was a bet. Was he buried wearing his famous black Neil Young T-shirt? And the legend is that whoever tried to open the coffin was trying to see if he was buried with that T-shirt. Isn't that bizarre?
That is very strange. Well,
that was Jacksonville.
I was going to say, we're just about out of time, and I hate how the time flies by when we have you on, Gary. I hope that you can make that radio show happen with Richard Serrett, so that we can just hear this kind of stuff all the time. It's amazing. But
well,
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, we've got many more stories, and I love doing shows with you guys. I mean, I consider you guys two of my good friends, and we just need to do it some more.
Oh, absolutely. And what I love about it too is that when you are giving this story, and you're sharing this information with people, like, you have to understand, Gary's not a guy who's just going on Google and looking into these stories and finding out more about it. He's talking to the people that were involved in this. He's friends with the people who were involved in these stories and who were around this. And there's no greater wealth of knowledge when it comes to this kind of stuff. It's one of my favorite topics that we cover. And I just wanted to put out one last push for everybody to pick up your books and follow along with. How can people follow along with you online and on social media?
Well, I do have a web page. I need to hit it more often. It's rgarypatterson.com. If you want to be a friend with me, look me up on Facebook, still under rgarypatterson.com. Chris and I are friends, and Tim and I too. I think we're all friends.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I'm always glad to have new stories. Always glad to meet new people, and usually I post a few things about where I'm going to be doing. I'm doing some live shows with George Norrie. It's called George Norrie and Friends. I've done one in Vancouver, 2 in Toronto, and I did one in St. Louis last summer. And so I understand I'm supposed to do a couple of more. So if you're in one of the areas, come over and meet me, hang out. We'd have fun. And maybe someday I can come up to Massachusetts and we can do a convention and talk.
Oh, I really hope so. I mean, every time we talk about putting on a convention, we've said for a number of years, like, let's put on our own, pop culture convention or paranormal convention or whatever. I always say, my first guest, we got to have our Gary Patterson come up, because after that,
I love it.
And what I think too is, what I think people will be impressed is when they follow along with your work and they follow, it's one thing to just put out a story and put out a book of stories and to have them exist out there, but you follow up on them. You're always updating things. Like you said, always finding new things. So absolutely 100% follow Gary and all of his work. I'm sorry that we only have a minute left. Oh, come on. But we will definitely do this again, Gary. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you, guys. Always glad to.
And we definitely will not take so long to talk again, you and I. So
good.
All right. Thank you, and have a great night. We'll keep up to date with everything.
Thanks again.
Talk to you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Chris, we just gotta start calling him the legendary R. Gary Patterson.
The legendary R. Gary Patterson. I could really seriously just listen to him for like another 3 hours. And some of these stories I've heard multiple times, and I don't care.
Right. It's and he said that we're his friends, so that we can carry that around forever.
And not just Facebook friends. He said, like, you guys are my friends. And then he started talking about the Facebook friend part. So,
listen,
we're there.
We've been doing this for a long time. We don't geek out over a lot of these people that we talk to. We geek out over talking to Gary.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Well, that does it for the really quick. Who's on next week?
I believe next week is the Outlander, Heidi Hollis.
All right. So stay spooktacular.